ever thought about my responsibilities?
Oh, Jack, what are you talking about?
Have you ever had a single moment's thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers?
In this video, I am going to take a closer look at the character Jack Torrance from the film The Shining, and the ways that his descent into madness seems to be predicated by attempts to come to terms with his conscience. Conscience is a term used to describe a voice that comes from within a person's psyche and attempts to push one towards certain paths and choices in life. It is often seen as being entwined with ideas of moral right and wrong, intentionality, and a sense of character. Conscience can be understood as what attempts to move individuals towards better ways of living for both themselves and those around them. Conversely, when one does not listen to their conscience and continues to ignore what is being asked by this voice, the voice can turn into a guilty or bad conscience, which can lead one to engage in acts which are harmful and destructive to their life. By a closer examination of Jack's character, I hope to show the ways that by ignoring his conscience and looking past his faults, he is led to identify with his bad conscience, eventually leading to his downfall. With this information in mind, let's get into the analysis. At the 35-minute mark of the film, Jack and his family have been at the hotel for several days, and he is woken up by Wendy at close to noon. Jack says to Wendy,
I suppose I ought to try to do some writing first.
Indicating his gradually growing tendency towards procrastination and avoiding the thing he came to the hotel to complete. Although he has had nothing but time since arriving at the hotel, while it can also be argued that he has been afforded much time to complete writing in his life in general, it seems like he can never get around to doing what he needs to do. Shortly afterwards, we see Jack in the lobby with his typewriter unused in the background, and he is repeatedly throwing a ball against the wall. Perhaps we are seeing a glimpse of what Jack has been used to in the past, in terms of avoiding what is calling him in life, and instead distracting himself with mindless activities. It seems that he has been misguided and without direction for a good portion of his existence, and as we see him aimlessly walking around the hotel, cross-cut with shots of Danny and Wendy walking through the outside labyrinth, we are provided metaphors for Jack's refusal to allow his conscience to steer the ship in the right direction, and instead plunging deeper into the depths of his psyche. The etymology of the word conscience tells us that it is a special form of knowledge or consciousness. The peculiarity of conscience is that it is a knowledge of, or certainly about, the emotional value of ideas we have concerning the motives of our actions. According to this definition, conscience is a complex phenomenon consisting on the one hand in an elementary act of the will, or in an impulse to act for which no conscious reason can be given, and on the other hand, in a judgment grounded on a rational feeling. At the 43-minute mark of the film, Jack is sitting at his typewriter, seemingly busy, and Wendy comes down and asks how things are going. When she asks if he has been able to write much, he replies with an unenthusiastic yes. He is starting to become irritated and annoyed that she is talking, although she in fact seems genuinely interested in his work. When she inquires further, Jack's anger escalates to another level, and he claims,
Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me, and it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
It's almost as if Wendy is acting like the conscience that Jack is trying so desperately to avoid. Even with her high-pitched voice, we could hypothesize that her voice sounds similar to the voice in his head. It is a noise that is grating to his ear, as he seems to be annoyed by hearing things that he doesn't want to acknowledge. As Wendy indirectly reminds Jack of the things he's not accomplishing, he turns to defense mechanisms and starts projecting his problems onto her, claiming that she is the reason that he can't get anything done. Projection is often used when individuals want to avoid the reality of their own problems, and instead make their problems about others so as to avoid any mental distress. As we will see later in the film, this seems to become a favorable tactic for Jack as a way to avoid the responsibility he should be taking for his own actions. At the 53-minute mark of the film, Danny goes to the family's apartment in the hotel in order to retrieve something from his room, and he sees Jack sitting upright in his bed. Jack asks Danny to sit with him, and Jack appears completely zoned out, as if he is deep within his mind. He asks Danny in a flat-toned voice if he is having a good time, indicating his disconnection from any emotional interest. Suddenly, Danny asks him,
Dad,
Yes?
do you feel bad?
This could be interpreted as Danny asking if Jack feels bad physically, but more likely it is regarding his mental health and how he feels about himself as a person, how he feels about his past decisions. Jack claims that he is only tired and that he needs sleep, but perhaps his inability to sleep is due to his poor choices and the conscience that has been weighing on him so heavily. Danny later asks if Jack would ever hurt he or his mother, and Jack says,
Never do anything to hurt you. Never. You know that, don't you?
Danny is referring back to times in which Jack has been violent with him, as well as premonitions about future violence. Despite Jack's denial of this proposition, we have consistently seen the ways that Jack's words and promises do not match his actions, and that despite an inner dictate that is telling him to do better, he continues to side with his egocentricity. Conscience, no matter on what it is based, commands the individual to obey his inner voice even at the risk of going astray. It cuts sharply across our subjective intentions and may sometimes force an extremely disagreeable decision. Conscience is a demand that asserts itself in spite of the subject, or at any rate, causes him considerable difficulties. At the 1 hour, 3-minute mark of the film, Danny had just been found, abused, and in shock, and Wendy has accused Jack of performing these deeds. Jack leaves the lobby and walks through the hotel enraged, dismissive of the idea that he could be blamed for something he didn't do, even though past instances indicate that as a likely possibility. He enters the bar of the ballroom and he says,
Anything for a drink. Get my goddamn soul. Just a glass of beer.
and with this statement, we are provided a great deal of information regarding who this person really is. Jack is someone who has tried to get sober primarily due to bad decisions and a conscience that has been haunting him. But now that things are getting difficult again, and he is being met with adversity, he is looking to turn away from what faces him, and instead is looking to numb things with alcohol. He is interested in returning to his formerly problematic behaviors, the behaviors which have led to a recent intensification of conscience. For Jack, it is better to avoid and distract rather than work on the glaring issues in his life. Since olden times, the conscience has been understood by many people less as a psychic function than as a divine intervention. Indeed, its dictates were regarded as the voice of God. This voice must possess a comparably higher authority than traditional morality. Anyone, therefore, who allows conscience this status should, for better or worse, put his trust in divine guidance and follow his conscience rather than give heed to conventional morality. After requesting the drink, the bartender Lloyd appears out of nowhere and is ready to serve him, as well as take Jack's soul, all with a satisfied smile on his face. We can essentially see the appearance of Lloyd as Jack's inching closer to an identification with his bad conscience. After he has served his drink, Jack says,
Here's to 5 miserable months on the wagon and all the irreparable harm that it's caused me.
Instead of continuing to work on himself and look towards betterment, he breaks his sobriety and decides to dismiss any progress he has made. As Jack takes the first drink, we see the pleasure he gets from it, almost as if the whiskey is a magical tonic that transports him to another world. Jack then starts venting his frustrations about his recent life and the events that have taken place, reverting to a victim mentality for much of the story. He is blaming Wendy and Danny for what has happened and is failing to take responsibility for himself. He is doing the opposite of what someone in Alcoholics Anonymous might do, in which they admit to faults and the darker aspects of themselves, offering them the opportunity to reflect and change. Instead, Jack is looking for ways to escape from his conscience, to project his shortcomings onto others. Wendy soon arrives in the ballroom and states she now believes a woman was the one who hurt Danny. Jack's first comment to her is,
Are you out of your fucking mind?
and just as he had been projecting his shortcomings onto his family a few minutes ago, he is now projecting his descent into madness onto his wife as well. In practice, it is very difficult to indicate the exact point at which the right conscience stops and the false one begins, and what criterion it is that divides one from the other. Beside the positive, right conscience, there stands the negative, false conscience, called the devil, seducer, tempter, evil spirit, etc. Everyone who examines his conscience is confronted with this fact, and he must admit that the good exceeds the bad only by a very little, if at all. At the 1 hour, 20-minute mark of the film, Wendy has become highly concerned about Danny and his well-being, and wants to leave the hotel immediately. Jack responds in-proportionately to this request and says,
It is so fucking typical of you to create a problem like this when I finally have a chance to accomplish something, when I really end my work. Wendy, I have let you fuck up my life so far, but I am not gonna let you fuck this up.
We are seeing the ways that Jack's level of projection is intensifying the further he moves away from listening to his conscience. Not only has Jack used projection and blame to escape his responsibility for harming Danny, but he is also using projection as a way to remove blame from himself regarding his failed career. It has become apparent that Jack is using these tactics to escape the torment of his conscience and to make his problems about other people, particularly the two people closest to him. He proceeds to walk down the hall, throwing furniture, being reckless, and thinking about the ways his family has ruined his life. And despite his title as caretaker, he is far removed from the type of care that is required within this job. Conscience, and particularly a bad conscience, can be a gift from heaven, a veritable grace if used in the interests of a higher self-criticism. And self-criticism, in the sense of an introspective, discriminating activity, is indispensable in any attempt to understand your own psychology. The sting of a bad conscience even spurs you on to discover things that were unconscious before, and in this way, you may be able to cross the threshold of the unconscious and take cognizance of those impersonal forces which make you an unconscious instrument of the wholesale murderer in man. At the 1 hour, 44-minute mark of the film, Wendy has been able to go to the lobby while Jack is absent, and she begins reading through Jack's writings. As she flips through the pages, she is met with the sentence being repeated over and over again that all work and no play make Jack a dull boy. Although Wendy is dumbfounded and horrified to find these writings, we can take a stab at understanding what Jack is trying to communicate through this senseless dribble. It's as if Jack is reflecting on his struggles to be productive in his writing, his struggles to make something of his life for all these years. But despite the realization of the struggle, he has not identified the problem as something interior to himself. It is not due to his lack of follow-through or commitment. He is instead saying that the reason for his problems is that he hasn't had enough time to relax, that he hasn't had the ability to play and take his mind off work. But looked at from an outside perspective, this is the opposite of the truth, and we realize that Jack is once again blaming circumstances and people for his own inability to manage his time and take care of his duties. Shortly after, Jack finds Wendy and he stalks her around the lobby, preaching to her about responsibilities and morals. He asks her what would happen to his future if he didn't live up to what he said he would do. But this is somewhat of a rhetorical question, as we already know what has happened to Jack's future by not living up to his commitments. By continually looking past what has been needed in life and focusing on pleasure, play, and mindlessness, he has become a bitter and defensive person who often uses others as his scapegoat. And although his conscience has been trying to push him towards decisions that may have been morally upright and good for his future, it was apparently too much for Jack to handle, resulting in him seeking the sure road away from his problems. But in the words of Carl Jung, anyone who takes the sure road is as good as dead, a saying which proves to be quite fitting for the way things end for Jack. This concludes this video on the psychology of The Shining. Please watch my other videos on other TV and film characters if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.